an aircraft carrier and they attacked the main islands of Japan. I'm sure you've read about that and heard about it. So that's the very same kind of plane that took off from the aircraft carriers. They had to learn to do a very short takeoff, obviously, but with the aircraft carrier going full speed into the wind, they had a lot of help from the wind direction to do that. Okay, then after one full year of training, including that B-25 training, they sent us overseas. We left from Florida, went across the Caribbean, into South America, over to a place called Natal on the very eastern tip of Brazil. We couldn't make it all the way across the ocean, so we landed at Ascension Island. It was just practically a volcano. It was owned by the British, where we could land, refuel, spend the night, and take off the next day for Africa. We landed here at Ghana, the Gold Coast of Africa, and went across, and eventually ended up in India. One of the advantages of flying that way was it took us about 2.5 weeks to get to India. I'll tell you in a minute why we went to India. But we had a chance to stop every night and rest and refuel. And here we were stopping at the Taj Mahal. I wonder how many of you know about the Taj Mahal. Have you heard of it? A very, very beautiful temple in Agra, India. And this is me sitting on a bench there with the Taj Mahal in the background. This is scaffolding they put on the dome of the Taj Mahal, thinking that the enemy might try to attack it. Okay, I'm going to spend a minute or two on this map to explain why we were sent to India and China. That there was a game of gotcha going on there between the Japanese and the Allies, including the Americans. And it went something like this. The Japanese had invaded China in 1937. It had closed all the ports to the Free Chinese, and the Chinese largely had to move way back into the western part of China, up in this area, up against the Himalayan mountains. And so the Japanese were doing two things. Not only were they closing the ports here, but they were bombing the innocent civilians in this part of China. So the Chinese, and that time, the Japanese said, "Gotcha, we want you to surrender to us." So the Chinese came to the Americans and said, "Would you please do two things? Would you please supply us with materials so that we can fight back the Japanese? And would you please do something to stop the bombing of these innocent civilians?" So the Americans responded, and to stop the bombing, they sent a group called the Flying Tigers. It was an American volunteer group of people who had been asked to resign their commissions from the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the Army, and as civilians to go to China, because the country was not at war, our country was not at war at that time, to go to China and attack these Japanese bombers. So we did that, and the Americans did go there. The Flying Tigers went to China, and just a few days after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Americans, at that time the war had been declared, the Americans were shooting down Japanese bombers that were attacking the city of Kunming. Now, according to Chinese intelligence, those bombers took off from Hanoi down here in what is now Vietnam. And the Chinese intelligence said that only one of those Japanese bombers returned back to its base, and it was so badly shot up that it never flew again. So the Americans had done a great favor to the Chinese by showing that they could do that. Okay, then the second thing the Americans did, since the Chinese said, we want supplies so we can fight the Japanese, the Americans set up an airlift that started here in the northeastern part of India and flew across this branch of the Himalaya Mountains called the Hump and landed here at Kunming. And they brought in war supplies, not only for ourselves, fuel and ordnance, but supplies for the Chinese as well. So those were the two things that America did for China at that time, and then America was able to say, gotcha, this time. Okay, and I might say that Chinese are forever grateful to us for having done that. I myself have been invited back to China six and seven times even to make presentations to the Chinese like I'm making to you today, because they're just so grateful that the Americans went to China and did that. They still remember. So okay, so it was our turn to say gotcha. All right, well the Japanese said, not so fast, Americans. We've got a plan. So the Japanese came in 1942 and invaded Burma, and they had three things in mind. One, they wanted to bring fighter planes up here to shoot down our cargo planes flying the Hump. The second thing, they wanted to invade India, which they did right here. And the third thing, they wanted to close the last remaining supply route to China. The land supply route was called the Burma Road. So the Japanese came in here, they closed the Burma Road, they brought fighter planes up here, and in the railroad system here going through Burma, they were able to bring fuel and ammunition for those fighter planes. And I'm sorry to say that those Japanese fighter planes were successful. They shot down at least 6 of our cargo planes flying the Hump, and as many as 30 or 40 other airplanes that were also flying supplies from India into China. So then it was the Japanese turn to say, gotcha. Okay, well, but the game is not over. So the U.S. decided to protect that, rather to attack that supply line through Burma. So they sent 3 groups of fighter planes and a group of B-25 bombers, the kind that I flew, and a group of B-24 heavy bombers, called a 308th bomb group. The U.S. sent those over, and I was one of the pilots in B-25 in the medium bomb group that was sent over. And they sent our squadron to the Calcutta area, in this area here in the eastern part of India. And our job was to fly over into Burma, Mandalay. You've probably heard of the city of Mandalay, in that area, and do everything we could to knock out every bridge, every railroad train, every airfield, every barge on the river, anything at all, warehouses along the river, anything that the enemy was using to bring fuel and ammunition up to their fighter planes in the northern part of Burma. So that was our job during 1943, and I think we must have knocked out every bridge and sunk every barge and even laid mines in the Irrawaddy River with the help of the U.S. Navy. So having done that, we had stopped the shooting down of our cargo planes. And whenever I hear of somebody who had a family member who flew these supplies over the Hump, I hope they appreciated the work that we were doing there to stop those attacks on their cargo planes. Okay, then it was our turn to say gotcha. So it was back and forth, and then these situations happened all during the war. In 1944, our squadron was moved up into China to the Kunming area, and we continued our attacks on Japanese supply lines. Most of the missions that I flew were down into what is now Vietnam. At that time they called it French Indochina. And we were attacking quite a bit in this Hanoi, Haiphong area. the enemy had a big naval base and a lot of fighter planes over on Hainan Island, and in fact some of our airplanes were shot down by Japanese fighter planes making that attempt. The longest mission I ever flew was to a place which is now called Da Nang. At that time it was called Touraine. It had the old French colonial name. And that was quite a long ways. We had to stop and refuel at a place here called Nanning. So, okay, I'll go on now. I'll give you an idea of why we were there and where we were. This is what our base looked like in India. Again, we were about 100 miles west of Calcutta. Calcutta, which is the main city there in India, in eastern India. As you can see, our buildings were called bashas. They had thatched roofs and mud walls, open windows and doors. And people were running all around our air base at all hours of the day and night. We had a lot of malarial-bearing mosquitoes there. And we had snakes, a little short snake called a crite that was deadly. They were cobras. And our living conditions were not all that great.
What was that?
This picture was taken of my crew 2 or 3 months after we arrived in India. This is the airplane we flew. This is me over here. I was a pilot. 2 of our crews actually are missing, not one. One day, well, first of all, they broke up our crews so that we could all fly with more experienced crews the first few missions, just so we'd find out what it was all about. And I guess we learned what it was all about, and it wasn't very pleasant, but anyway, we volunteered, and this is what we did. But my co-pilot that I flew overseas with was asked to fly with another crew one day when we were given word that there was a Japanese merchant vessel down in the Bay of Bengal, and 3 airplanes were assigned to go down there and attack the Japanese merchant vessel. Well, when they got down there, they found it was not a merchant vessel at all. It was a Japanese cruiser, and the searchlights were all up, and the anti-aircraft guns were firing. Well, the lead plane of the 3 got through okay. I guess he had the element of surprise in his favor. But the other 2 planes, the second one that my co-pilot was on, was shot down, and the entire crew was killed, and the airplane was lost. The 3rd plane, I don't know to this day